Scottish Cup win at Hampden in '85, and the league clincher in dramatic style in '86 at Love Street. Next we have John Paul Taylor, who has recently returned to the club as the new supporters liaison manager. And I'm sure anyone who has worked with John Paul down the years will know he's the perfect man for the job. We'd like to welcome John Paul back to Celtic and wish him all the very best in his new role. We have David Potter, well-known Celtic author and historian, with us today. David wrote the Willie Maley book, so who better than David to tell us the story of Willie Maley? I'd like to welcome Chris Mackay, who told the story of Willie Maley's headstone on a popular Celtic forum, and with the help of the family and the club, it was restored to its former glory. Last but not least, with Father John Sweeney, who has recently been promoted to parish priest at St Maria Garetti Chapel in Cranhill. Father John is a Celtic season ticket holder and will conduct a blessing of the headstone today. We'll then place some flowers and we'll have the opportunity to have some pictures taken. Ladies and gentlemen, as we stand here today in the club's 125th year, it puts things into perspective that Willie Maley devoted his life to the club for an incredible 52 years. Almost half of our history involves this one man, known as the Boss. And throughout that history, much of it could be summed up in famous quotations from Willie Maley himself. Celtic Park, where a man is judged on his football alone. We did it by playing football, pure, beautiful, inventive football, Jock Stein. The battle is over, the rebels have won, Brian Dempsey. And if you want to buy a player, you'll have to pay for him yourself, Jack McGinty, Davy Hay in 1986. But one of the most enduring quotes is 6 words that shaped the course of our history, almost before it even began. When Brother Walfred visited the Maley House on 12th of December 1887 in an effort to sign up Tom Maley for the new club, the story goes that Tom was out and the Celtic delegation got talking to his brother Willie. When asking for Tom to get in touch, Brother Walfred added to Willie Maley the famous words, "Why don't you come along too?" Maley responded modestly that he was a second-rater about to quit the game for cross-country running. But just like the great Jock Stein, who would also play down his playing ability decades later, it was his management skills that he would be best remembered for. Where would we be if Willie Maley hadn't came along too? We'd be a far lesser club. Within 10 years, Willie Maley not only played almost 100 games for the club, he took up the role of match secretary, honorary secretary, and finally secretary manager in 1897. Finally, when he gave up the game in 1940 after 52 years, it took 2 men to replace him, Desmond White as secretary and Jimmy McStay as manager. In between, he built 3 great Celtic teams, the 6-in-a-row team from 1905 to 1910, the 4-in-a-row team from 1914 to 1917, and the great Empire Exhibition Cup winning team in 1938. A total of 19 league titles and 15 Scottish Cups as a player and manager. But what he left us is so much more. He taught us how to play football the Celtic way, as we still celebrate. He taught us how to play football the Celtic way, as we still celebrate in song. He reared his own homegrown talent to play a fast, attacking, attractive passing game. He built the Celtic spirit, that never say die, will to win, attitude, traditions, ladies and gentlemen, that live to this day. But I'll leave the final words to Willie Maley himself, near the end of his lifetime with Celtic, and I quote, "What I have done for Celtic in the past, I would gladly do again. It has been a labour of love, and I hope that when I am gone, my successors will lend to their work the enthusiasm and love of the club, which has been almost a craze for me." Ladies and gentlemen, Willie Maley. Please dotted line, Jim Craig.
Reverend Father, members of the Maley family, ladies and gentlemen, Willie Maley's record is quite a remarkable one, and as Brendan said, lasted a long time. And all during those years he was up against outside influences that he had to overcome in order to produce these football teams. The first one was that he was only 29 years of age when he became secretary manager. And footballers don't always get on with each other, so at that point he would have risen out the ranks and become the man who picked the team, and there would have been players that wouldn't have liked that very much, and he would have not liked some players either, or not liked the way some players play. So it's been a difficult period for him. He had some initial success, but then had kind of 4 very fallow years until 1904 when they won the Scottish Cup. And then they were off on tour to the continent. They had an immediate problem because while they were away, the North Stand burnt down and part of the pavilion was damaged as well. They came back again and had that wonderful run of 6 in a row that Brendan said, also reached the final of the Scottish Cup and won it in 1907, 1908, and then 1909 when they played Rangers in the final. They were hit by the Hampden riot when the game finished a draw after 90 minutes, and the crowd was unsure whether extra time was going to be played. The players lingered on the park for a while and then started to leave the field, and a section of the crowd got very angry at that and made a fair mess of Hampden, and eventually the fire brigade had to be called because they had set fire to some of those buildings as well. The next problem he faced was, of course, the First World War, and some players went off to the war, some stayed. Celtic lost players during the war. But Willie Maley had to cope with all these things because in those days managers were the mouthpieces of the club. We don't get a player just come in from abroad telling the papers, as we saw yesterday, what Celtic have to do to be a successful team. It was the manager that did the speaking in those days, and he was the one who had to face the press, and of course when the players who were killed in the war, he also had to deal with the families and make some kind of recompense for their loss as well. And at this time also he had to cope with the rise of sheer bitterness, sectarianism, whatever you want to call it, between the other half of the old firm and Celtic. When Harland and Wolff opened their shipyard in Govan, they brought over thousands of workers from Belfast, none of whom were going to support Celtic under any circumstances. And of course Easter Rising in Dublin in the mid-1910s led to a little bit of a backlash towards the Irish in Scotland, and that didn't help either. And it really got quite serious, and football was being played in a very disgraceful attitude. And Maley had to cope with all that as well. And then at the start of the 1920s, after a real period of dominance by Celtic, Rangers rose almost from the dead there. They lost their manager, William Monkton, who was drowned in an accident off Gourock. And Bill Struth came in, tough cookie, realised that the team had to be fit, disciplined, and hard and tough. And he sorted his team out like that. And suddenly they were the dominant side in the country, and Willie Maley had to deal with that as well. Still had our successes. We won 5 trophies in both the 1920s and 1930s, but it wasn't as good as it had been before if you look at it on paper. Then in the middle of the 1920s he had another problem to cope with because the offside law was changed. They only changed one particular line from 3 to 2. At one time you had to have 3 players between you and the opposing goal to be offside, and it split to 2. The goal scoring rate rose again. Teams started banging in the goals. A lot of managers were very unhappy with that, and so they changed the attacking centre half of the time to a defensive centre half. And one of the first teams to do it in Scotland was, of course, Rangers. And ironically, the man who became their stopper centre half was Jimmy Simpson, Ronnie Simpson's father, and that helped seal their defence. And Celtic took a few years to work out that that was the way to play nowadays, and with the result that Rangers were allowed to win quite a number of trophies. Then in 1931, Celtic started that decade with a Scottish Cup success. They beat Motherwell 4-2 in the final and went on tour to America. Tragically, only a couple of months later when they came back, he had the death of John Thompson. And again, Willie Maley had to cope with all the press coverage of that. He would have been the mouthpiece for the club. And that must have been a really dreadful time for any manager. He had to deal with Thompson's fiancée, Thompson's family, and answer all those questions that the press want to know as well. Was it an accident? Was it not an accident? And it must have been really difficult. And unfortunately, within a matter of years, he also lost Peter Scarf, the inside left in that cup final team, to TB, and Bertie Thompson, the outside right, who had heart failure. And again, you know, just a dreadful time to be a manager dealing with things that you don't really regard as part of your job. And of course, even during the success of the late 30s, when they won the league in 37 and the Empire Exhibition Trophy in 38, Willie Maley by that time was an old man. And there would have been a cynicism of the younger players. Is this old guy still able to do the job? Because that always happens no matter what you're like. And young dentists do it to me, by the way, as well, so I know how they feel. And he must have been a really, really tough man himself, Willie Maley. He would not have been the easiest man to deal with. As someone who had a very nice and successful Celtic career with another legend, he also wasn't the easiest man to get on with. So I'm pretty sure that Willie Maley was the same. But Celtic in all those years, from 1888 as a player right through to his managerial career finished in 1940, Celtic were lucky to have him. It's great to have members of the Maley family here today, and I would like to congratulate you on having such a distinguished ancestor, and also on behalf of Celtic fans everywhere, to thank you for giving the club such a talented and successful manager player. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Jim. Just ask John Paul to say a few words.
Morning everyone, thanks very much for asking me along today. It's a great honour and privilege to come along and represent Celtic at such a prestigious ceremony. I've got some words together about Willie Maley. For 50 years Willie Maley was Celtic. It's quite ironic really, considering, as Brendan says, that it was originally his brother that Celtic had sought in their search for talented footballers. But Celtic were fortunate to get Willie Maley. Over the years, Willie built a number of successful Celtic teams and introduced a number of great players and legends to the game. Players like Alec McNair, Jimmy Menemy, Patsy Gallagher, Jimmy Delaney, and the great Jimmy McGrory. Every week we sing proudly about Willie Maley's teams and the great Celtic way of playing football, the Glasgow Celtic way. I think it's fair to say that the Celtic way is about an attacking tradition, and how, as a club, we always like to go forward. It was adopted by the great Jock Stein and adopted by Tommy Burns in later years. I think over the years it's proven very successful for the club. I think today's opportunity also gives us, or today's commemoration also gives us an opportunity to speak about or reflect on what Willie Maley and men of his era left for us as Celtic supporters. On Wednesday evening, the club took to the field in the San Siro Stadium in Milan to take part again in the Champions League. I think from humble beginnings it's fair to recognise that we now sit proudly at the top table of world football, where Celtic really should be. In recent weeks and months, a number of different initiatives have been undertaken by Celtic as part of their recognising their charitable aims through the 125 for 125 tradition, and having taken part in the 64-mile cycle to Cardendale last week. I've still got the blisters to prove it, but it's been a terrific initiative. But my efforts pale into insignificance when we consider that a couple of weeks ago 60,000 people turned up for the Stillian Petrov match to recognise and honour a player whose career was cut short as a result of his illness. That match generated hundreds of thousands of pounds for charity, for cancer charities, but it also will live long in the memory, and it gave us all a great feeling and sense of pride to be part of this great Celtic family. Willie Maley started a journey of highs and lows which has lasted for 125 years of unbroken history at Celtic. Through triumph and tragedy, he built a monument to Glasgow, created a Scottish institution in what is now a worldwide phenomenon. Celtic now, through Willie Maley, is truly as a club like no other. Willie Maley is a Celtic legend. Thank you.